Hi, and welcome to The Horn, a podcast from International Crisis Group. I'm Alan Boswell. Today I'm talking to William Davison, our senior analyst on Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in the midst of a massive political change, centered around the rise of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. As Ethiopia grapples with its uncertain future, we're going to walk you through how we got here and where we could be heading. We let this one run a bit longer. Enjoy. Will, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining us today in Addis Ababa. I know it's a public holiday over there, actually.
Yeah, that's right. It's Timkat. But yeah, thank you very much for having me.
First of all, we are 8 months away from Ethiopia's scheduled elections. Can they be held on time still?
Yes, I think they could be held on time. There's certainly a pretty strong commitment to that, or strong ambition to hold them on time from the government. But that isn't to say there's not serious logistical challenges. And it should be noted that this August the 16th date that's been suggested is tentative. And that's really because it falls right in the middle of the Ethiopian rainy season. Obviously the Prime Minister and his allies and others have promised us that this will be a free and fair and competitive election, which Ethiopia hasn't held since at least 2005. And there are many more political actors in the game, and they are considerably stronger than in the past. So it promises to be quite a feisty and competitive election. There's also been significant reforms to the electoral board, and then there's an intention for the media and civil society to be stronger and in a better position to monitor what's going on in this election. So there's a bunch of reasons why there's sort of logistical challenges, and what the electoral board has done is push that as far as possible. But by doing so, they have put it in the rainy season, and that means there could be problems in terms of access. So there's still a little bit to be worked out around that particular issue.
I'd say on the big picture overall right now on Ethiopia, it seems like we really have two different stories about the way the country's heading. There's the dominant, widely known good news story, I would say, of the rise of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, promising ambitious reforms to move Ethiopia out of decades of authoritarian rule. And then there is this other story, which is really the same story, of a massive uptick in violence and a political system that is essentially unraveling. Are both of these stories true?
Yes, to some extent. They're both true. What's happened over the last 18 months, I think almost everyone agrees on, is something of an opening of the political space. So previously, a lot of opposition actors were either jailed or exiled, or they were just simply cowed by the sort of prevailing repressive circumstances in Ethiopia. With the major period of anti-government protests, sort of 2015 to 2018, and then the change of leadership at the top of the ruling party and the government, that was part of some very significant changes. So a very comprehensive political amnesty. So all of the political prisoners and tens of thousands of others released, most major opposition figures coming back from exile, also journalists being released from prison, and generally an opening of the political space. Now, the issue there is that period of increased dynamism and opportunity has also led into volatility as well. These seismic changes at the top of the ruling party, at the top of the government, at the top of the security services, they have very much created this sense of a transition, moving from one political era into another. Therefore, all of these sort of newly empowered and liberated political actors, they sense an opportunity to shape Ethiopia's future. So that's what's sort of feeding this dynamism and therefore the volatility. Of course, that's clearly an insufficient explanation, right? Increased political aspirations does not have to lead to sort of over 3 million internally displaced people from conflict, and sort of thousands of people dying in intercommunal conflict. And to understand that a bit better, I think it's important to understand that this period of anti-government protests both reflected the sort of disarray of the ruling coalition and the government to some extent, but it also exacerbated it, right? It put pressure on the prevailing system, which, for right and wrong, and it was quite a repressive system in many ways, had kept a lid on some of these political aspirations, also kept a lid on some of these intercommunal conflicts that we've seen breaking out over territory and power sharing issues, other sort of resource competition type conflicts. The only thing that I want to add there is that, of course, we always need to put these events in context. So whilst it's obviously worrying that there's been this increase in intercommunal conflict, over the last 18 months, including very much since the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power. Of course, before that, there was a very serious conflict primarily being carried out between protesters and the state itself. So, as many people have pointed out, we're moving from a sort of vertical conflict there to a more horizontal one.
Interesting. Yeah. So I want to take us back and very much look at how we got to this place currently in Ethiopia. So a lot of this has to do with what is known as Ethiopia's ethnic federalism system, but its political structure of having many supposedly constitutionally somewhat autonomous, ethnically based regional states. How did Ethiopia end up with this system? The
system emerged in the early 1990s, or at least it's solidified in the early 1990s, and the constitution that you're referring to came into force in 1995. The reason that occurred is that there was a significant change of power in 1991 in Ethiopia. So that was when what was known as the Derg military regime, a nationalist, socialist regime, that's when it finally left power. And this coalition of ethno-nationalist rebel groups, they took power, and that was the EPRDF coalition.
Right. And so that system is as you say, is sort of formalized power sharing between these different ethnically based political parties, which were previously part of the liberation movement that took power from the Derg. And so then this system was around for quite a while, for several decades, and led by Meles Zenawi, and then he died, and it started to fall apart, which sort of brings us up pretty close to present day. So how did this system start to really come apart at the seams?
Yeah, so Meles's premature demise. He was only 57 years of age in 2012. was a very important landmark in the EPRDF era. But we shouldn't give the impression that all was well before that. There had always been considerable opposition to that. And maybe look at the 2005 election as an example. That was Ethiopia's previous free and fair election, but it resulted in protests when the opposition claimed that they had won. And eventually the government, obviously the EPRDF government cracked down on them and jailed all the leaders. Within that 2005 situation, the last competitive election, there was these very stark differences of opinion about the constitutional system, about the type of federalism that were the backdrop to that political contest, which ended in serious violence. So it's not to say that everything was well and good before 2012 by any means. I think to simply explain what happened after 2012, Meles had been an effective leader and political manager, both of the EPRDF and therefore of the wider federation. With Meles's death, it sort of intensified the sort of interregional power struggle, including the one played out within the EPRDF itself, within this ruling coalition, which was made up of 4 regional ruling parties allied with the ruling parties from 5 other regions. So Meles died, and that sort of discipline that had characterized the EPRDF broke down. And instead, we had sort of considerable competition for power between regions, obviously very much including competition for power at the federal level. And most people would agree, some sort of increase in corruption. It was actually quite a boom time for the economy. And so these were the dynamics that were occurring within the EPRDF. And then the broader backdrop to this was 2 sort of pretty sham elections in 2010 and 2015, where because of the EPRDF's total monopolization of political power in Ethiopia, including of all tiers of government, and then considerable outreach across society as well. There was really very little space for the opposition to campaign, and so we had these pretty absurd results where the EPRDF just monopolised parliament and all regional councils as well in 2010, 2015. So all of this tension within the EPRDF and then growing resentment from the opposition because they had been totally shut out of the political picture.
Right. And then we have Prime Minister Haile Mariam, who succeeds Meles after he dies. And amid this context that you describe and a very large and sustained protest movement, eventually Abiy is made the next leader of this EPRDF. And then he inherits what's essentially a massive political crisis at this point. And he did so with a massive swell of popular support. So first of all, I mean, what has he really done right?
I think what Abiy did right is really capture the moment and understand that in that period in 2018, that came at the end of a very long rule by the EPRDF, with many people sick of its authoritarian tendencies, also of aspects of its sort of ideological, very absolutist ideological approach, and sick of everything that came with this sort of approach in terms of abuse of human rights and all sorts of civil liberties. So Abiy in his inaugural speech, he criticised the state that he inherited for sort of systemic torture. So immediately marked himself out as a departure from the past. So I think that was an absolutely critical moment, because essentially, it wouldn't have taken long for the protest to have continued if Abiy had been perceived to be just a sort of a figurehead, rather than representing substantive change. From there, he went on and reached out to Eritrea's president Isaias Afwerki, and Isaias accepted his offer of a rapprochement there. And obviously, that was a highly significant event, although has not been sort of fully capitalized on since. Unfortunately, Abiy very much pushed ahead with the political reforms, which the EPRDF had initiated and Haile Mariam had presided over, but that's to say this comprehensive political amnesty and inviting the exiled parties back to Ethiopia. He did that in a very full-throated manner, meeting, having pictures taken with opposition figures, again to show that he was a clear departure from the past.
That was a very quick jaunt through a lot of history, and we could talk about a lot of that a lot longer, but we need to also, I think, look ahead in this episode, because, of course, what's going on in Ethiopia right now is somewhere between a crisis and a massive opportunity, and is probably both of those things, but is also just hugely complex. And so you have these elections coming up, which we mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, and you have this remarkable rise of Abiy to power, and he in some ways starts dismantling the very system to some degree, or signaling that he will, that brought him to power. And now he's looking at taking this EPRDF, which is essentially just a power sharing among these liberation parties, very ethno-national based. And now he's talking of dissolving that, even though he's the head of it, and creating a new party called the Prosperity Party. This, as we talked about, as Crisis Group explained in a recent report of ours, has become very controversial, and is also very tied to this question of what is Ethiopia, what is its political structure, is it a federation of different ethnic blocks, or is it a centralized state? Can you explain where we're at right now with this move from the EPRDF to this new party, the Prosperity Party?
Yes, for sure. I mean, just to be clear, the Prosperity Party is now up and running, and those EPRDF parties that you mentioned have now been dissolved. So it's very much underway. And again, just to step back a bit and provide a bit of context, with a personal note. Last year, when I was looking at the situation, then it was obvious that Abiy was, as I just explained, he was trying to present himself as a clear departure from the past. One of the dilemmas that I was highlighting, and I'm sure other people were as well for Abiy, was, well, he was the leader of the EPRDF, but he seemed to have a plan to lead the EPRDF to its destruction. So the plan to move Ethiopia into a post-EPRDF era seemed to be a fairly logical one. given its three-decade rule and the anti-government protest. But it just wasn't clear how the leader of the EPRDF was actually going to do this. Well, now I and many other people have a very clear and resounding answer. Abiy's project was to dissolve all of these constituent parties of the EPRDF and create the Prosperity Party. The point of saying that is that, yes, the creation of the Prosperity Party has been quite radical. I think it's been quite rushed. I think there are problems and tensions within it, and we will talk about those. But we should also note that this is a significant development in terms of overcoming some of those transitional problems that Abiy was presented with last year, which people like me were highlighting. So it is an achievement, even if it comes with some problems. In terms of the issues that the Prosperity Party is presented with, maybe on the sort of the positive side of the balance sheet. The concern, or one of the big concerns in Ethiopia, is that we don't just have a state structure where ethnicity or sub-state nationalism is institutionalized and formalized, but we also have political parties which match those government structures as well. So one idea for sort of moving Ethiopia away from a politics which is just too much focused around ethnicity and other identity issues was creating sort of multi-ethnic or at least sort of non-ethnically exclusive political parties. And of course, the Prosperity Party is an approach to do that. It's a single national party. Anyone, anywhere, of any ethnicity can join it. And so it's very distinct from those parties of the past. That's, in many people's eyes, that's a progressive step.
Why? And I also imagine there's many Ethiopians who were either mixed ethnically or just lived as minorities in different regions who also felt like they didn't have any political home under the previous system.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So many people in urban areas in Ethiopia would either just see themselves as Ethiopian, or they would have some mixed heritage, and they wouldn't really get too hung up on their identity. And then there are people with a clearer identity. For example, the millions of Amhara people living in Oromia, quite hard for them to get the sort of political representation and maybe government services they want because they are Amhara and Amharic speaking and they're living in Oromia. And they might also feel threatened for other reasons as well. So there's no doubt that it's not a system that works for all Ethiopians. But of course, that's a rather obvious thing to say because we know that this system is contested, and that's that is what's playing out now, really. And with regards to Prosperity Party and its challenges, the easiest way to sort of understand this is that the 2015-2018 protests, which brought change and brought Abiy to power, were multifaceted, and in many ways they were sort of an anti-authoritarian protest. But the fact of the matter is that they were very much spearheaded by the Oromo protest movement. And that Oromo protest movement, its primary concerns was Oromo rights, and including the sort of or the degree of autonomy for Oromia region and the share of power for Oromia and Oromo politicians at the federal level. The point here is that there is a very strong component of ethnic nationalism or identity politics to the protest movement that brought Abiy to power. The opportunity presented by the transition has led all Ethiopian political actors, whether it's from a sort of ideological perspective or a regional perspective, they are all in the game, and some of them clearly oppose this multinational system, and to some extent the creation of the Prosperity Party is speaking to them, as it is a move away from ethnic politics. But it isn't necessarily a move and a political party which is what the Oromo protesters want to see. They don't necessarily see why the Prosperity Party is going to advance Oromo interests, perhaps in terms of putting the Oromo language as the second language of the federal government, or increasing the autonomy of Oromia, or increasing Oromo power at the federal level. In fact, there's concerns that it dilutes group identity and therefore makes it harder for people to pursue their political interests in terms of organising along group lines. So whilst Prosperity Party might be seen as a generally progressive thing, it's not necessarily a vote winner, especially in places like Oromia.
Right. I mean, one of the really interesting and, of course, very complicated things about this is you have this ethnic federalism structure sort of spearheaded and created by the EPRDF. And then the challenge to that system, those parties themselves tend to be mostly ethno-national parties themselves. And then you have the old party, which had created the system, trying to move itself away from an ethno-national party to a degree. And then the challenges to it tend to be the very protest movements, which are very ethnically based themselves. So I imagine for outsiders, and many times when you're talking about this, Will, to outside interlocutors and diplomats, you might just hit a bunch of confusion sometimes when you start to try to explain this.
Yeah, no doubt. It's multi-layered, and it's dynamic as well. So it's not staying still. I mean, just maybe to speak to some of the reason for that sort of fragmentation and confusion. EPRDF very much responsible for the federal system as it exists. The EPRDF was generally perceived to be dominated by the TPLF, by the Tigrayan element, and the Tigrayan region has a significantly smaller population than, for example, Oromia and Amhara region. One of the reasons for the opposition, and therefore this dynamism, is that the other larger regional factions were not happy with the power-sharing arrangements within the EPRDF, where the TPLF were given equal voting measures, right? Equal voting weight, 25% each. They didn't think that was fair and equitable, so that is one of the reasons for this contestation within the EPRDF. So it isn't the essence or principle of power sharing that people didn't like, but it was the voting share, but the apportioning of voting weight between the different ethno regions that people were concerned about. Well, just another source of confusion here is that whilst, again, the EPRDF instituted a constitutional system based on the principles of self-determination and self-rule
by each of these regional states.
Exactly, and also sub-regional administrative units. But almost to sort of counteract this sort of centrifugal system that the EPRDF had set up, as in the formal government structure and the constitution, which encourages autonomy, almost to counteract that, they established a very centralized party structure, and again, with a strong perception that it was dominated by the Tigrayans. This means that the de facto autonomy of either Oromia leaders or the different sub-regional ethnic units in the south of Ethiopia, wherever you look, whilst on paper they had all sorts of formal autonomy, in reality they said that all major policy decisions, whether education, security, health, fiscal matters, they said that was all decided at the centre by the EPRDF, and to a large degree they were right. So this is why you've got this confusing situation where the party that instituted all of this sort of federal autonomy and everything that comes with that, then they were sort of being outflanked by people who were saying, yes, but in practice, you haven't actually delivered what you promised in the early 1990s. So I hope that clears up some of the confusion. I'm not sure I have.
I mean, well, so you have this formal constitutional system which the EPRDF comes into power in the early 90s and institutes, which is a really radical constitution that gives all these different regions and sub-regions autonomy up to the degree of self-determination. But in practice, the de facto system was that it was a very centralized authoritarian state, and it was even though the ruling party was technically a power sharing between four of these liberation parties. In fact, one of them, the Tigrayan TPLF, was in fact really in charge and dominated most aspects. And so then that launches this ethnic sort of, and so a lot of the reaction to that actually was from the the ethnic groups, primarily the Oromo and the Amhara, who have much bigger populations. They were, of course, upset with this, and that was kind of underlying and driving a lot of the protest movements that led to this. And so now we're at this place where this political churn that we're seeing of this old system kind of falling apart has created massive uncertainties. And just to give an example, I mean, there's a chance that Abiy's new party might not even win in his own region, Oromia, which of course played a major role in his rise to power to begin with. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. I mean, I don't want to get into too much political forecasting, but we can see a pretty powerful opposition movement brewing in Oromia. The activist Jawar Mohammed, other established parties who look to be presenting a major challenge to Prosperity Party, and very much presenting a challenge by running on a sort of Oromo nationalist or a sort of pro-Oromo rights ticket. And that does present a problem for the Prosperity Party. It's not the end of the story by any means, but Oromia has 178 seats out of 547 in the federal parliament. That's the biggest share of any region, as it's the most populous. That doesn't destroy the Prosperity Party's chances, but obviously, a major setback in Oromia to the Prosperity Party would raise the prospect of the Prime Minister and his Prosperity Party at least not winning a comfortable majority in the federal parliament, and then also the possibility that they have the more Oromo nationalist opposition who could be in control of the Oromia State Council, the regional parliament. This raises a bunch of questions, obviously. I think particularly in terms of how this level of competition going to play out on the ground? Is it going to be peaceful? And then also, if we do end up with a sort of multi-party environment and a much more dynamic federation, because we don't just have one party, the EPRDF, running everything. We have a bunch of different parties sharing the federal parliament and also in control of various regional councils. How will Ethiopia's federal system then operate in that new environment?
Right, because you might have and possibly very likely have regions that under this constitution have very large powers and might be led by now many different parties who might be very opposed to each other, which of course isn't something that this current constitution has seen yet.
No, exactly, and so that by no means is that the end of the world. I mean, pluralism and democratic competition is obviously something which most people welcome. But at the same time, plenty of people have concerns. At the moment, there is a lot of violence that's associated with politics. Should go now. There's all sorts of competitions over territory and power sharing, factors like social media exacerbating these tendencies. So whilst there was no reason that pluralism and multipartyism and a dynamic federation has to be a problem by any means, of course, that's probably the best way forward. There is a concern that this intensified political competition could lead to violence and could sort of destabilize the state even further.
Right. And I mean, in some ways, a lot of this discussion can sound very abstract and theoretical when it comes to, how Ethiopia is structured and ethnic federalism. But, we've seen a huge uptick in violence and millions of people displaced from violence kind of as this process has worked its way out. Can you go briefly kind of through describing some of the violence that we're seeing and the different drivers of it? What are we seeing across the country right now?
Recently, and particularly worryingly, I think, there has been an increase in tensions between the Amhara and Oromo political factions and groups. A historic rivalry there, and these are the two biggest and somewhat ascendant powers in Ethiopia. So potentially, their competition at the center and the need to balance power between them is going to be a sort of defining feature of Ethiopian politics. And then, recently we've had, again, an incident that was triggered and then led to more widespread violence between Oromo and Amhara elements, which has been a recent worrying event back in October.
Well, and I just say that if those two regions very much become at odds, in some ways that breaks up the coalition that brought Abiy to power.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think most people would agree that that coalition between the Oromo and Amhara factions in the EPRDF and in the wider political landscape was primarily an anti-TPLF, the Tigrayan ruling party. It was an anti-TPLF alliance, so something of an alliance of convenience. It didn't necessarily mean that they, by any means, that they shared ideologies and interests, and that they'd worked out a way to proceed. And in fact, that's to a sort of somewhat worrying degree, that seems to have been what's transpired. And just to clarify that for the listeners, the Oromo nationalist narrative describes imperial Ethiopia as one very much dominated by the Amhara, and emperors and kings from Amhara having been engaged in the conquest of Oromo land, so particularly in the late 19th century under Emperor Menelik. So the Oromo nationalist movement is to some degree an effort to correct what they see as those historical wrongs.
Right. So you have, I think, what we've described as a very breakneck political transition, and a lot of, in some ways, a lot of tensions that are obviously coming to the surface with that, but also a lot of sort of existential questions about what Ethiopia is as a nation and a state. One of the things Crisis Group has recommended is that if things look like they are starting to spin a bit out of control, it might be worth considering delaying this election. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Well, I think that's really bringing into question the ability to hold a satisfactory election in what are already very disadvantageous circumstances to be doing so. So this is the issue that Crisis Group is attuned to. That there is clearly there is a challenging environment. Clearly there is huge amounts of political volatility. If that political volatility leads to more of this type of violence that we've seen, well, possibly the wrong thing to do then would be to press ahead with the election, especially if it was likely to be contested. Maybe people would try and delegitimize the electoral authorities. Would the best thing then to do to be to sort of bring all the political actors together, try and calm things down, and try and plot a sort of more gradual and inclusive way forward? But clearly this is just one way of viewing the situation. We're kind of ringing the alarm bell on this. Other political actors, many other political commentators, think that the worst thing for Ethiopia would be to significantly delay the election.
We spent a lot of this episode talking about a lot of, in many ways, the doomsday scenarios and a lot of the problems that have accompanied this political transition. But so what's the optimistic scenario of where this could all head?
I think the optimistic scenario is that the what is in some ways maybe a premature election in terms of preparation, that focuses people's minds on democratic politics. We would then move forward into a campaign period, which would be pretty feisty, let's say, in terms of the way people go about their campaigning and their messaging to their core constituencies. But there's reason to hope that it could also play out in a relatively peaceful and democratic fashion. It does seem unlikely and to some extent undesirable that there's some sort of overwhelming majority for the ruling party and for the prime minister. Therefore, we could be presented a situation where we have that type of pluralism we discussed before. So maybe, the Prosperity Party, maybe with some allied parties, similar-minded parties, they sort of cobble together a majority, maybe a reasonably comfortable majority at the federal parliament, but there is a decent opposition representation in parliament, and then there is this pluralism across the federation, almost undoubtedly, with the TPLF still running Tigray region, maybe the Oromo opposition running the Oromia regional state. What would be key then is that everybody accepts that Ethiopia is then a genuinely multi-party environment, and they have to debate and do business and cooperate where they can with their political opponents. Ethiopia will still need to have some sort of coherent health and education, security policy, all sorts of federal issues to manage in terms of security and fiscal matters, as well as quite a lot of disputes about the federal system as well. So what would be important is that moving into that multi-party environment, that people don't try and totally discredit their opponents, but they look at ways to work with them whilst debating the disagreements they have with each other through democratic channels.
In that scenario, does that mean that this constitutional reform that people are expecting, and in some ways that Abiy has promised, that sort of re-looks at how Ethiopia is structured, that in reality we might be something that's actually less of a formal break with the past in terms of how Ethiopia is structured?
Yeah, this is the most divisive political issue, I think, in Ethiopia, about the federal system as it exists and where to go with it. I think clearly, this sort of multi-party scene and sort of inclusive democratic politics, everyone needs to be accommodated to a certain extent if there's going to be some sort of consensual, peaceful power sharing and accommodation with each other. Like with any of these sort of political disputes and political crises, what we're looking for is some sort of compromise way through where each actor gives something. As far as I am concerned, I don't see any prospect of peaceful, radical reform of key tenets of the federal system as it exists. That means that if you made moves to significantly remove degrees of autonomy from some of these regional states, or if you tried to break them up into more manageable sizes, I think that could well lead to conflict. So as far as I see things, that sort of radical approach doesn't look like the right way forward. But at the same time, it's very important to accommodate the opponents of the system. And there also are sort of many ways in which certainly the functioning of the Constitution, I would say also the design of the Constitution, could be improved. For example, the Ethiopian constitution is built on the principle of self-determination, and it actually sort of actively encourages that and places very few constraints on it. Could there be a consensual process to not ban self-determination, but just add in, a slightly more sort of tighter approach to it, a legal approach to it? So there are, certain sort of constraints on the type of self-determination that the different groups can achieve. That's just one example. What I'm talking about is a sort of constitution, a managed and somewhat limited process of constitutional reform where you can start to refine the functioning of this system, but do it in such a way which doesn't cause some sort of major breakdown. And just very quickly, the other point to make here is that even if there are problems with the constitutional design and its functioning, if Ethiopia moved into a stage where all of its democratic institutions were working perfectly, and therefore the individual rights granted by the constitution were actually protected by the judiciary, and also the protection of them was assisted by the media and civil society and all sorts of other elements within the broader system, then that would go a long way to improving the sort of functioning of the federal system and the abuse of rights that occurs now. So you could have a sort of two-step or sort of two-track process where there's the intensified democratization, and then also hopefully some sort of constructive process to start refining the function of this federation.
All right, Will, I think we're going to wrap it up with that. I think it speaks a lot to the complexity of Ethiopia in general and this particular transition they're going through, that it feels like we both covered a lot of territory and in some ways didn't cover nearly enough. So thanks for your time and for all the work you're doing over there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that feels like it will have to be sort of part one of a 5-part series, so I expect to be invited back.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about Crisis Group and read our reports at crisisgroup.org or follow us on Twitter at Crisis Group. Once again, I'm Alan Boswell. This episode was produced by Mae Francis.